I now want to move into the topic of problem solving. To introduce some of the concepts surrounding problem solving, I want to start with an example. There's an issue that has arisen to address the problems with our curriculum, to ask the question, where are there biases or where are there gaps in addressing racial injustice? And psychology has had a long history, and that history has been filled with contributions to racism. The problem is our curriculum is not adequately inclusive enough. Now, taking the concepts from the chapter on problem solving, one of the concepts has to do with the ways we define problems, right? There are well-defined problems, and then there are ill-defined problems. A well-defined problem is a problem that has a clear sort of goal built into it, right? And so we kind of can get a sense from the way the problem is defined, the possible moves we can make, the possible changes, and what the expected outcome should be in trying to solve the problem. An ill-defined problem is where that's lacking, where the phrasing of the problem is too vague. And this can make it difficult to solve the problem because you don't have a clear sense of what the problem really is. And this is a frequent issue that comes up across many areas of life. I want to get an A paper, right? That's if that's the way the problem is phrased, that's a very broad and sort of, it's specific in terms of the grade, but what that really means is kind of lacking specificity. Or bringing it back to the issue, we want our curriculum to be more inclusive and less biased in addressing social issues. Well, that's not a terrible beginning for a problem, but it could be better defined. What does that mean? What are we actually trying to do? Well, one aspect of this is trying to change the content and the way the material is taught in the classroom. And this means addressing the syllabus first, and also then considering the implementation of that syllabus in the classroom. So we start moving from an ill-defined problem, racism is bad, for example, to much more specified problems, a more well-defined problem. And this determines what is called the problem space, which is the kind of the total set of moves and solutions that are available to someone within a given problem. Now, just like in decision making, there are certain kinds of biases, heuristics, and judgments that we can make that can be problematic. We also have such heuristics in problem solving as well. And I'll mention one which is sometimes called the hill climbing strategy. And the basic idea is that the moves you make to solve a problem ought to get you closer each time to the ultimate goal, right? And that in general, that sounds like a good strategy, right? Make moves that get you closer to your goal. But there are some times in which that's not the best approach, because sometimes you've got to take care of other issues that, the expression, you got to take a few steps back before you move forward. So sometimes you've got to address more basic issues, or you've got to take a less direct route to solve a problem before you can go the direct route. So, we're trying to incorporate social justice content into our curriculum. And one way you could think about this is, let's put more of this content in our syllabus, right? Let's add a course objective, let's add an assignment, and that will move us closer to our goal. Superficially, it does. But the problem is, if you haven't addressed some preliminary issues that are maybe more fundamental, yes, you'll get closer to your goal, but you're going to end up hitting a roadblock because you didn't address a more fundamental issue. So, for example, if there is an underlying problem, a bias in how we teach the material, or there's a sort of distorted thinking around race, right? We're not thinking about social justice issues, race issues systemically and in an integrated fashion, the plopping in of social justice objectives and assignments won't actually move us completely in the direction we're wanting to go. And it will just feel like it's something sort of thrown in there that meets a sort of external demand rather than being sort of meaningfully integrated in the course content in the way that it was intended. And this can end up leading to further problems when students and others feel that there's remains bias in the curriculum because we haven't really addressed the underlying issue. So sometimes you gotta kind of examine more fundamental issues and before you can move in the direction of your goal in a more explicit manner. So there are some useful strategies that, in particular, expert problem solvers employ to solve a problem. So one of them could be drawing upon analogies. How are we going to solve the problem of social injustice or the lack of inclusivity in our curriculum? Well, have we addressed similar kinds of problems before? We could look at how have we addressed something missing in the curriculum, like maybe the absence of critical thinking, and how have we reviewed our curriculum systematically in a way that we've helped to maybe improve this and remove the gap of critical thinking skills in the courses that we teach, right? Maybe we can draw a model from that to help address the current issue. But here's another kind of analogy. Have there been attempts to address racism in other areas, in politics and business, and that have been successful, that could serve as a model for how to address the problem of racism in an academic setting and with curriculum in particular? Another strategy that expert problem solvers employ is breaking down a problem into a series of sub-goals. When you're addressing a big problem like social inequity, it can feel quite a bit overwhelming and unmanageable. And this can lead to a sense of powerlessness and helplessness before the problem. In some ways, this can be an expression of white fragility when white faculty members are presented with the challenge of trying to become more inclusive, and the problem seems so big that they get overwhelmed, right? And they feel like it feels like it's too much. And so there's a way of actually maybe implicitly or unconsciously avoiding dealing with the issue by getting overwhelmed by it. But if instead we take the big problem and we break it down into smaller pieces, we can begin working on those smaller pieces, having sub-goals that will gradually accumulate to solving the bigger issue. Maybe, for example, we don't know quite where to begin with addressing these inequities. If we're tasked with this goal of trying to have a certain percentage of our courses be addressing diversity and inclusivity issues. But where to begin with this? Well, how about let's address the first question, which is, what are people doing right now? Can faculty members present their courses and talk about how they have self-consciously attempted to incorporate these already? Where do they identify the strengths and weaknesses, and what might they do to potentially improve this in teaching this course in the future? Get a baseline of where we're at, and let this be an opportunity to open up discussions about how to improve things across the board, right? So you're making the problem a little bit more manageable by focusing on a piece of it. And you could even break it down more. Like, for example, we might focus on an aspect of course objectives or aspect of the assignments. And, one step at a time, address these sort of things. Now, we have to make sure that we're addressing all the different steps, because if you're just addressing the surface area of what's in the syllabus, but not addressing implicit bias or other kinds of issues in the way you teach the material, that will be a problem. So that's obviously another sub-goal that's a component of all this. So my point to you is that if you're facing a problem, whether individually or as a group, a couple of things you might want to consider is whether the problem is defined well. Can you re-articulate the problem in a way that's a little bit more clear, more well-defined? Second, are there models or analogies you can draw upon, whether from your personal experience or the experience of others, that might help you think about how to go about solving the problem that you're addressing? And third, if the problem feels too big, then is there a way in which you can break it down into smaller chunks that are more manageable, right? So I've been talking about a very important issue about bias and inclusivity, but this can apply to things like writing a paper. Writing a paper can be an ill-defined goal, and it can be overwhelming to many students. Can you turn this into a series of sub-goals, right? Like, for example, right now I've been sort of putting off dealing with a particular manuscript that's been submitted for a journal, and I've had to get to it for a while, and it's been taking a while. And so what I decided to do is I instead of having the goal of review this manuscript, my goal today is look at the manuscript. Just take a look at it, right? And then maybe my goal tomorrow will be review the first 2 pages of this manuscript, right? So now it feels a little bit more manageable than if I'm trying to think in terms of review the manuscript. The last topic I want to address today is the concept of intelligence. Why is intelligence in the same chapter as problem solving? That's a good question, and in some ways one could argue that they don't belong in the same chapter. But I actually think it's quite appropriate that intelligence is in the chapter on problem solving. Because in my eyes, what defines intelligence best is not necessarily some ability to engage in answering questions on a test, or even necessarily how quickly you think, or some number that can be provided on a standardized instrument. Rather, true intelligence is your ability to solve problems. Good problem solving is what makes for a good intelligence in my eyes, and I think this moves intelligence away from the domain of the unchangeable to what can be cultivated and improved upon. Right? We can become better problem solvers, but at least the way intelligence is often talked about, it often feels like you're either in the smart or not smart domain. You're either in this percentile or that percentile, determined by genetics, supposedly, or early childhood experiences. And there are plenty of people who may not score well on intelligence tests, but are excellent problem solvers, and they're at an advantage over many people for that reason. That's one of the reasons I emphasize a lot about metacognition, thinking about your thinking how to improve your thinking, because the more you can do that, the better problem solver you're going to be. And this requires taking a step back from your situation, gaining experience, and learning strategies that can be applied to across the board in many situations. To begin, I want to just briefly mention about where does intelligence derive from. And this brings up the classic debate of nature versus nurture, genetics versus socialization. And there seems to be an intertwining mix, right? There is definitely a genetic component to what we typically call intelligence, but it also significantly influenced with the kinds of early childhood experiences we have, our social economic status, the kinds of enriching or non-enriching environments that we find ourselves in. And it's these social components that can take whatever genetic capacities we've been given and either maximize them or inhibit their growth or fruition. Another important component that influences intelligence test results of an individual has to do with racial bias. And there's a whole history around how racial biases have gone into the use of intelligence tests and the use of the concept of IQ to try to justify certain inequities in society. And it continues to be an issue to this day. Now, you won't see the kind of overt attempts to use intelligence in this way for the most part, but you will see how certain kinds of stereotypes that are living in people can influence how others do on these intelligence tests. There's a concept called stereotype threat. All right, so if you perceive yourself as being experienced with a certain stereotype being imposed upon you, and now you're engaging in a task that you're perceived to be not good at because of that stereotype, this can increase anxiety in performance and actually negatively impact that performance. And this is an important consideration for me as I do psychological and neuropsychological testing with someone of a different race and ethnicity than myself. To what degree is stereotype threat influencing the performance? And it's not an easy question to answer, but it's one that we need to be mindful of. Despite this history, I'm not someone who would say that intelligence as a concept is therefore worthless. We have to be careful to disentangle the misuses of the concept with its potential benefits and ways of helping us understand the mind. But even then, if we even do that, there are a lot of debates about what really qualifies as intelligence. Is it one thing? Is it many things? Is it organized among subcognitive abilities that are formed in a hierarchical relation? When it comes to the classic definition of intelligence, there's this thought to be this G factor, this general ability that can be summarized usually by a single number that permeates all other sub-abilities, right? And this is called G. But then there are also specialized cognitive abilities. So when I do a neuropsychological assessment, right? So I give an intelligence battery that looks at different kinds of intelligence, visual spatial intelligence, verbal intelligence, thinking speed, and working memory. And so you can get performances in these 4 different domains. You can also get a single score that averages across those domains. That's the G factor. And the way we arrive at those subcomponents, those subfactors of intelligence, is through a statistical method called factor analysis. And for this video, I won't get into the nitty-gritty about what this means. It's just a way of, through a statistical method, looking at what kinds of abilities seem to be distinct among all the kinds of abilities we're assessing. And through factor analysis, we can identify subdomains of intelligence, like the ones I mentioned already. Another way of talking about intelligence is in terms of being fluid or crystallized. To define these, crystallized intelligence is sort of your accumulation of knowledge, your semantic knowledge, your vocabulary level, your knowledge of facts. Fluid intelligence has more to do with your ability to engage in sort of quick thinking and mental manipulations to solve novel problems. It's instead of your ability to show what you know, it's your ability to address new situations, new problems quickly and efficiently. There's a big difference in how these change over the years as we age. Crystallized intelligence tends to increase as we get older, all the way up to our 50s. And then there is a gradual decline in this ability. So in other words, our knowledge of facts and vocabulary, it continues to improve as we accumulate this knowledge. In contrast, fluid intelligence, which requires that quick thinking, that flexible thinking, and the ability to mentally manipulate information and to address novel problems, this seems to peak around one's 20s and then kind of declines from that point on. For that reason, you might see a lot of mathematicians do their best work in their 20s at times, whereas writers, philosophers, and those in humanities might do their best work in their 50s. This concept of intelligence that I've been addressing so far deals with sort of more academic understandings of intelligence, right? How knowledge and your ability to deal with problems. But there are other kinds of intelligences that have been discussed that aren't often assessed in, like, for example, a psychological assessment. One of them has to do with practical IQ. Your ability to deal with real life situations. Sometimes the expression is used about to talk about street smarts as opposed to book smarts. So practical intelligence is a way of trying to capture that difference. And then there's emotional intelligence, which there's been a lot written on this, and is a very strong predictor of performance, often sometimes more than traditional IQ scores. So what is this? So it involves a couple of things. One is the ability to regulate your own emotion. So to be aware of what's going on inside of you and to be able to know what is appropriate to respond to and how to react and what is not. It's having a sense of not only what you feel, but why you might feel it. It's being in touch with your feelings. It's also the ability to access the emotional life of other people through empathy. Right? So this is an important intelligence for those considering a life of psychotherapy, of doing psychotherapy. Probably most famous of all is Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences, where he talked about a whole variety of not only kind of cognitive intelligence and emotional intelligence, but also like things like kinesthetic intelligence, which the athlete might be high on. So to summarize the points of this part of the video, we talked about problem solving and how effective problem solving can happen and why problems sometimes happen with problem solving. We then moved into intelligence, talking about some of the problems with its history. We then talked about different ways of defining intelligence, moving beyond the cognitive conception of intelligence into practical and emotional intelligence. So thank you for watching. The final video will be coming out soon that will address the topic of consciousness.